Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Food Business School's Food Biz Plus webinar this afternoon. I am Kathy Jorin, the director of the Food Business School of the Culinary Institute of America, and we're happy to welcome you to this monthly conversation with a food industry expert. The Food Business School is the Center for Graduate and Executive Education of the Culinary Institute of America, with the mission of enabling and empowering our students to design, deliver, and lead transformative innovations that address the world's most pressing food systems challenges and what we also think as its greatest business opportunities. So today we're going to have a conversation with Sophie Egan, who I'll introduce in just a moment. After our conversation, please stay on for a couple of minutes and I'll talk to you a little bit about what other things are new and interesting and coming up with Food Business School. So I'd like to introduce Sophie Egan at this time. Sophie will join us here visually in just a moment. There we go. Hi, Sophie.
Hi there.
Sophie is the Director of Health and Sustainability Leadership, as well as the Editorial Director for the Strategic Initiatives Group of the Culinary Institute of America. Sophie oversees a portfolio of initiatives aimed at helping the food service industry make its menus healthier and better for the environment. One of the CIA's key initiatives in her portfolio is the Menus of Change, the business of healthy, sustainable, delicious food choices, which includes a conference at our Hyde Park, New York campus, and an annual report, strategy toolkits, and editorial resources published throughout the year, as well as year-round thought leadership through the Menus of Change blog. In our conversation today, we'll learn more about Menus of Change and how it relates to food businesses, whether they are concepts, new startups, or ongoing businesses, small or large. Sophie will share the latest findings from the 2018 annual report of Menus of Change, as well as key topics from the 2018 conference, which took place in June, including a focus on plant-forward menu strategies. So welcome, Sophie, and please tell us a little bit about your background and your areas of expertise.
Absolutely. Well, thank you for having me. Can you hear me all right?
Sorry, 1 second.
Sounds like you cannot hear me.
Let's see. Do you have your speaker on, Sophie?
I see someone else who says we can hear
microphone?
you. You can hear me. Some people can hear me, other people can't hear me.
Oh, okay. Well, I'm glad.
Marvelous. Melissa and Allison and Megan and Laura can hear me, so I'm going to continue. Marvelous.
I got it. Please do.
Okay,
I've got
great.
it now. Sorry.
So, yes, thank you for having me. It's great to be joining you this afternoon. So, briefly, I'll share a bit about my background. So, before we get into the Menus of Change work. So, I am a writer and have a background in health and social behavior. So, in 2016, I authored my first book, which is called Devoured, and it's all about how what we eat defines who we are. And I really identify the way that American values shape eating habits. And I describe what I call the American food psyche and how oftentimes these kind of subconscious values really affect our eating habits in rather remarkable ways. And so that grew out of my master's of public health, which had the focus on health and social behavior. And that's really about how our environment cues a range of lifestyle habits, including eating, but certainly including physical activity and the environment being not only the built environment, but what's sort of socially normal and acceptable in the world around us. So I'll just very briefly share a little bit of an example of how an American value affects eating habits and what I mean by really kind of painting this portrait of American food culture. So one of the values is freedom. The three that I identified are work, freedom, and progress, and I get into these in the book in much more detail. But freedom is really this deeply held American value of individualism or independence, right? And that's different from other cultures where there's really a focus on interdependence. It's a sense of, in the United States, being very distinct and separate from others as opposed to part of a larger collective. And this really shapes our kind of, again, subconscious way of thinking about how we fit into the broader society in rather stunning ways. We want to stand out from the pack. We want to be exceptional. We don't want to be average. That's boring, right? And in terms of how it affects our eating habits, it's really remarkable. And one of the biggest ones is what I call here C is for customization. In the food world, and this really, I think, affects anyone who's interested in developing a food business, customization is expected, and it's only going to accelerate. If you think about, for example, in fast casual, the image is a little condensed, but we've all been to the countless build your own or assembly line style fast casual restaurants. Maybe it started with Subway, there's Chipotle, but now we have every type of cuisine, Blaze Pizza or Cava Mezze Grill, where really you are a participant in the meal making. And what's happening there in that transaction is you're sort of like a conductor. You are tailoring the food experience to match a whole range of factors that are unique to you. Your allergies, your medical profile, your mood that day, what else you have going on in the day, your religious beliefs, your cultural identity, you name it, right? And this ability to customize and individualize our food experiences, as I said, has really become the norm. And I describe the ways that this is really only getting more and more granular in the types of things we can dial up or dial down. You think of delivery services and being able to customize not only what you're getting, but when you get it, right? You could just imagine the many ways that customization is so deeply part of what eating in America is today. So the other real interesting way that freedom and individualism shapes American eating habits is the desire for transparency. We have a very strong held sense that it is my right to know what's in my food. It is my right to know who made it, how they made it, how the workers along the whole food chain were treated in the process of getting it to my plate. Again, the level of granularity and expectation for transparency in food experiences is, I would argue, only increasing. You look at consumer packaged goods, to shift away from food service for a second, and think about if any of you have seen Quinn popcorn or Community Grains. These are identity preserved types of packaging systems that actually let you trace your specific bag of popcorn to a specific plot of land, a family, the farming practices that were used there. And this kind of labeling and this kind of way of communicating with consumers through food packaging is, I think, really a signal of what, again, is going to become kind of the new normal. So I shared those just as kind of an example, the rise of the conscious consumer and the way that those all stem very largely from that one kind of American value. Certainly there's more in the book, and actually this bucket is so broad, it's the subject of the second book, which I'm just working on now. But that's really my night job. So I'm here to tell you really more about my day job, and the way that I think about these relating is that my writing and the work that I do, not only authoring, but I should mention I write for the New York Times Health section. I answer a lot of reader questions about common confusion about what's healthy or not, is that I really aim to improve the way that consumption is happening in the United States through better understanding. But in the work that I do with the CIA, it's really about affecting production and what's available on menus in the first place to increase the likelihood that what we end up choosing as consumers happens to be as best for us and for the planet as it possibly can be.
Sophie, in terms of the subjects of your book and the consumers that you're talking about, especially regarding transparency and the conscious consumer, do you think that that consumer audience spans a whole variety of demographics, or is it more particular to specific?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, there's without question quite a bit of
consumer, larger consumer
segmentation. They often, consumer researchers will call it psychographic as well as demographic, and that has to do with the different value systems or different priorities that different types of consumers might have. So not purely based on income and geography and so forth. But I think what's changed is that so there's a spectrum, but the whole body of population has moved towards greater transparency. So even if you're at the lowest end of the desire for transparency, your expectation is still far greater than it ever was, right? So you just think about the ways that it doesn't matter if you. So certainly there are the people who are buying the identity preserved grains, right? That's maybe, I live in San Francisco. That's maybe the Berkeley population, or for now. But even, let's talk about Panera, or name your, ubiquitous Starbucks, right? This is very mainstream, very widely available all around the United States. Those places are really emphasizing transparency, and Panera has its famous, no list of the things that the ingredients that it really does just will not allow in its products. And so I think what you see is just this overall elevation of the desire and the expectation to know more information about food before you put your dollars towards it than there was in the past. But as I said, it sort of stems from this deeply ingrained notion. Oh, I think we have a little delay. I'll pause there.
Mhm. Great, thank you. No, that's great. Thank you so much. So let's get to menus of change, and maybe you can talk a little bit about your role at the CIA, and especially related to menus of change.
Sure
And
thing.
then
So the
let's delve
CIA,
into a little bit about the
primarily
purpose and
culinary
goals of
college, of
menus
course,
of
training
change.
future chefs, has a division called the Strategic Initiatives Group, and we provide thought leadership to the food service industry. And I oversee, there are four main pillars of that thought leadership, and I oversee all of the efforts that we do that have to do with health and sustainability. So these include conferences, providing strategy toolkits, culinary inspiration, recipes, a whole host of resources that food service industry professionals can utilize to implement the sort of evidence base that we're presenting them with. And yeah, Menus of Change is really the kind of the flagship in that domain. So this is a partnership with the Harvard T.H. Chan School of Public Health. The tagline, "The Business of Healthy, Sustainable, Delicious Food Choices." And the initiative was founded in 2012, and it's really groundbreaking in a couple of key ways. So one is that it brings together groups of people who historically have never really conversed, and really looks at the major issues around food in a systems lens. So scientists, chefs, business leaders, NGOs, media, all working together to develop or to identify and scale the most business-friendly solutions to public health crises like the obesity epidemic, type 2 diabetes, antibiotic resistance, as well as the most pressing environmental problems like climate change and water scarcity. So the other really groundbreaking component is these principles of healthy, sustainable menus. So these 24 principles are integrated. And by that I mean for a long time, you had food service industry professionals sort of consulting various sources. So I'm going to go over here to the Institute of Medicine and find out what I need to know about sodium. Oh, wait, I need to go to, the world, the FAO from the UN and learn about agriculture. And oh, shoot, what about produce? Who do I consult for that? Maybe USDA. So this really brings it all under one roof, and the guidance that we provide is really meant to be a one-stop shop. So the principles are integrated. They're a unified set of guidelines for menu concepts and operations, as well as food and ingredients at the intersection of nutrition science and environmental science. And they're also, very importantly, evidence-based. So as opposed to the he said, she said, or such and such famous blogger or diet book that can change all the time, these have not changed. These are the extremely well researched, solid science. Certainly we revisit them each year if there have been major changes, but by and large this is the a foundation that the business leaders can feel really confident making business decisions on, as opposed to sort of the ever evolving kind of trade winds of consumer demands and new trends and so forth. So this is at least to know in terms of what's backed by science. And so these principles were developed by a scientific and technical advisory council that's made up of leading nutrition and climate researchers from all over the United States. And it's chaired by Walter Willett, who is the former chairman of the Department of Nutrition at Harvard T.H. Chan School of Public Health. And one of my favorite things to say about Walter is that he's actually one of the most cited people in all areas of science. And you talk to him, you're like, oh well, who else is up there? And it's like Einstein is also among the most cited. But really, point being that it's the best of the best in terms of the minds to help us point the food service industry toward what they absolutely need to know in terms of the science. And we really distill it in a way that's very approachable. So as you can see here, the infographic, these are the very kind of most concise versions of these guidelines, but there are certainly more depth provided on the Menus of Change website. But the goal, of course, for us as the CIA and the Strategic Initiatives Group is to work with these scientists. And then a lot of my role is translating this into a menu strategy, a business strategy. What does that actually look like on the plate?
Exactly. And I think that's just so important to emphasize that, these are developed by an incredibly diverse group of experts that people can feel confident that they are valid and that they won't change, like you said. And then, of course, translating them into a workable format for restaurateurs or people in the food industry who want to develop their businesses to understand how to incorporate these in their businesses, I think is really important. Given that there are basically 10 concepts related to menu concepts and operations and another 14 related to food and ingredients, if you had to identify and highlight a few key ones for someone to get started with incorporating these into their current menus or business plans, are there some that you would
we do hear this all the time. Gosh, there's 24. Where do I start? And that's very understandable. It's a lot, but that's also the beauty of it being all in one place, right? One of the things that we provide, just before I get into kind of what to pay the most attention to now, is actually we have a gap analysis tool that allows operators to go principle by principle and say, how are we doing in all of these areas? And often what people find is actually they've got quite a few of the bases covered, and it sort of points to the areas, oh yeah, we haven't really been paying as much attention to sodium as we should, or okay, well, you know what, this year we're really going to focus on these, and in the future we'll realize that we should carve out the time to make those more of a priority. So it's not aimed at being done all at once, and so I think the question of kind of where to start is a great one. So one of the things that we have really arrived at that's gained a lot of traction in the industry is a notion called plant forward. So I'm going to explain that, and then I'll come back to the question of which principles these touch on. But plant forward is, as we define it, is a style of cooking and eating that emphasizes and celebrates, but is not limited to plant-based foods, and that reflects evidence-based principles of health and sustainability. And this umbrella term is a way of actually connecting quite a few of the principles here, all in one general framework. And the reason that we arrived at this is that when you take a step back and you look at all of these principles, the answer to your question is that by far the most effective change that any food or food service industry professional can take to have the greatest impact on our natural resources burden as well as chronic disease risk is red meat reduction. So it's just red meat we define as beef, pork, and lamb. And so the principle serve less red meat less often is the one that sort of has the most bang for your buck in terms of the impact on the environment and on health. However, it's so much more than that, because one of the things that Walter Willett always is great at pointing out is as compared to what? you don't just reduce one thing. What do you eat instead of it? And so that's where plant forward, and it's where I really think it's important to emphasize the interconnectedness between so many of these principles. And so when we talk about this definition of increasing whole grains and other legumes and soy foods and so on, what you see is that you're really hitting nearly all the food and ingredient principles. Make whole intact grains the new norm, move legumes and nuts to the center of the plate, think produce first, choose healthier oils. Good fat, not low fat, is really about nut butters and nuts and so on, also quite related to healthier oils, of course. Reimagine dairy in a supporting role, use poultry and eggs in moderation. So you essentially indirectly hit quite a few by aiming toward kind of having plant forward as your North Star. And so what that just means is it doesn't mean shifting everything to vegetarian or vegan. By no means is that what we are advocating for. It's really about what we call the protein flip, which is just a reverse of the emphasis, or a shift in emphasis away from kind of the standard where animal, not only meat, but really animal proteins in general are the center of the plate, and value in a food experience is long defined as, the T-bone steak spilling off the plate with like one piece of broccolini and maybe a potato, to really using meat as a condiment. We talk about blending. There are a lot of different strategies built up in the protein flip, which you can read more about at menusofchange.org. But really the point that I'm trying to make is that it's just about this culture shift that moves us together in terms of consumption away from what has been a very out of proportion emphasis on red meat in our culture towards elevating more plant-based foods along the way. And so there are a lot of ways to get there. But the other thing I'll just mention is that in terms of the principles related to menu concepts and general operations, plant forward is a B2B term. We're not telling anyone to have your menu say, here are our plant forward offerings of the day. It really comes down to, I think if I had to pick one from the other column, it's really lead with menu messaging around flavor. And it also is this leverage globally inspired plant-forward culinary strategies, because so much of the rationale for our plant-forward thought leadership is the recognition that while this might be relatively novel in the United States, all around the world, many, if not most, cuisines are inherently plant-forward because meat was more scarce, it was more expensive, and there's just more of a tradition of using either a very small amount, really get a lot of flavor, or where it was even entirely vegan or vegetarian, and you just didn't call it out as such. So it's really about how you go about menuing and shifting a business model to be more about this. But if you start to pay attention, you'll see that right now we have a long way to go in most contexts, where at most you have maybe one entree that isn't, all about the meat, right? So that's what we mean in terms of signaling the culture change that we're trying to bring about. And as I said, along the way, you're going to wind up hitting quite a few principles.
Thank you, Sophie. So true that, as much as we talk about all of these things in terms of their environmental impacts and the health focus, really it boils down to people wanting to eat them because they're delicious. And if they don't crave them like they do other foods, then we won't ever make progress in this area. So the idea of menuing them and focusing them on their deliciousness is very key. And of course, like you say, all these cultures that have been around for hundreds of years, many of them which are inherently healthy have always been very plant focused. So thank you. A couple of questions came in related to this that I'd like to address. One of them being about the point to offer more seafood more often, and how do we incorporate that along with also consideration for over harvesting and
yes. So one of the things
that are more
this is actually
available.
A great opportunity for distinction. So I see the question says asking about serving more seafood more often, and actually the principle is about serving more kinds of seafood more often, and that's a really important distinction. So what we're really trying to do is increase the diversity of species that are consumed when we're consuming seafood. So for health reasons, Americans actually currently don't eat quite as much fish and seafood as would be recommended nutritionally for optimal intake of omega-3s and so forth. But we absolutely overharvest and overconsume the top four species, tuna, salmon, and so forth. And we're really urging greater appreciation among chefs and indirectly among consumers for species that are either they're called underutilized, or a great term that I love is underloved, or that are and so sometimes that happens with shifting to what we call supply-driven or restaurant-supported fisheries, as opposed to the demand-driven norm that has prevailed in restaurants forever, where the chef goes and says, I need this many million pounds of X, Y, and Z because that's people want swordfish, or they must have branzino, or whatever it is. And instead it's saying, well, what's available given the location that I as a chef operate in, what's available now, what's at this moment in time, at where geographically where I'm located, the looking at the stocks of different species and so on. So a great program, an example of that is Dock to Dish. If any of you have read about this, it's a very inspiring program. Providence is a restaurant in Los Angeles that has kind of helped to pioneer it. So that's a really great example. And the other thing that I'll mention, in addition to more types of species, is to eat lower on the food chain. So we call them lower trophic species, and this actually has a much greater impact. So this is those small oily fish, the sardines, the anchovies, even lots of mussels and so on, which are extremely
Sorry, everyone, just 1 second. We've lost Sophie. Yep. We're just asking her to restart her camera. So hang on just a second, everyone.
healthy and basically kind of fill the need.
Sophie, if you can hear me, I think if you can.
All right, can you? Oh, yes. So where did you lose?
We lost you
Did you
there
hear
for a
about
minute,
Dock to
Sophie.
Dish?
We probably missed the last couple minutes of your time. Sorry. But I think that
Oh no.
let's see.
Okay, excellent. Yeah, I think that was basically the end of my
About
comment.
the
Oily
fish on the
fish. Thank you,
lower
Robert.
end of the food
Yes,
chain.
so that was basically the point was
Yes,
just
we
that
did hear
those
Dock to
two
Dish
sides in
and
terms of
lower end of the food chain fish.
helping to address the very good question that was asked. Okay, so yes, we can move on.
Oh, I think you're back. Okay, let's see if we can answer another question that came up a minute ago, which is about how to incorporate principles in a convenience store setting.
Yeah, so I think
What would you
the
recommend for
greatest
someone
thing
to
that C-stores have
promote
done
healthier
is
choices in given that traditional product
I wouldn't
mix?
quite say they think produce first, but they do offer whole produce at the front of the counter as a checkout. So one of the things we know in C stores and really in retail in general is that things that are, I think it's like 80% of purchases are impulse buys in retail settings, and they occur often, while you're on your way out, right? It's why marketing towards children unfortunately works so well, because it's those lower on the, items that are at their eye level, and okay, toss the Snickers bar in the basket. So I really found it really fascinating. I think it's something like C-stores are like the #1 place that people get bananas from in the United States, for example. So I think the more that C-stores use their ubiquity to offer whole, fresh fruit as something that's within the brand identity of a C-store, which is cheap, quick, affordable, right? And I would argue to increase the diversity. I personally would like to see more than just red delicious apples, but more seasonal fruit, and really think about those prime real estate locations of front of the store or right by the checkout, to have baskets of beautiful produce as much as possible. So that's one area. And then, of course, C-stores also provide prepared foods. And this is where, you could certainly make whole intact grains the new norm by having composed grain salads as a portable lunch option. It doesn't need to just be the white bread sandwiches. On that note, sandwiches with whole grain bread goes a long way. And just offering more plant-forward prepared foods in general. So, right now I think an example is what else maybe can be utilized. What other ways can we utilize, say, the rotisserie hot dog thing? Are there other things we could use that are maybe, elote? Like, why can't I get elote from, roasted corn, corn on the cob to go? So just, I think, really thinking about what's the infrastructure of a C-store that we could use to increase options that are produce-centric, or nuts, legumes, and whole grains, and so forth.
Great. Thanks. Great suggestion, Sophie. Let's talk a little bit about the Menus of Change dashboard and how that has evolved over the last few years of Menus of Change, and what it means, and what kind of impact we've had, or what kind of changes we've seen.
So it's a little hard to see on the screen here, it's a little condensed, but essentially in the Menus of Change annual report each year, we provide this dashboard, which is essentially a scorecard of the food service industry's progress each year in addressing these 12 key imperatives of health and sustainability. And you can think of them as being related to the principles, and kind of these are sort of the issues, and the principles are the solutions. So the issues, we use a scoring system of thumbs up, sideways, and down, try to keep it very simple. And each year the scores are determined through a many months long process that I help to lead with our 2 advisory councils. So I mentioned the Scientific and Technical Advisory Council. Excuse me, but we also have a Sustainable Business Leadership Council, and essentially the Science Council arrives at consensus of what the severity of the issue is, and what the degree of urgency should be given that severity. So you could think about the obesity crisis, the climate change, the huge risks to not only the environment but to human health from climate change. And then we evaluate with the Business Council the extent to which the food and food service industry is responding with an appropriate degree of urgency based on the past year. So that's essentially how the scoring works. So I won't go through all of them, but I'll just share a couple to give you a little bit of a sense, kind of what some of the most interesting outcomes were of the 2018 scorecard. So the first is agriculture, drugs, chemicals use, and animal welfare. And what was really interesting is, so the first time we were able to see data that was species specific on the use of antibiotics in the meat supply. And what you found, and why this got a score of a 4, was that really, actually, for the first time overall, antibiotic use is declining. And this has been years and years of increase. It does not mean we're where we need to be. And I should say the scores are about, right, the extent to which the industry is responding, not the extent to which the whole problem is solved. Just is it being recognized as an issue and things are being done. So, if you just look around, of course, we see commitments by pretty much every major restaurant chain out there across the board, fast food, fast casual, casual. And really what's been really heartening and why this gets, some credit is that it's now, I think, fair to say that you're the exception, not the norm, if you don't have in place some kind of commitment or roadmap for phasing out antibiotics in the meat supply, and we see this too with producers. So that's really heartening, and it's really a huge credit to how quickly the industry has responded. The biggest issue here, for those who aren't familiar, is that the routine use of non-therapeutic antibiotics in raising animals who are raised in very close quarters to one another is really creating a situation where humans where essentially our antibiotics are not effective anymore for medical treatment. And so you have all kinds of resistance genes going on or resistance strands going on, and this is a huge crisis if you think about just the strides that have been made in medical arenas for all kinds of things. I mean, you get an earache or what have you, and to be at risk, the efficacy of those medications. So the one thing, though, that came out of the species-specific data is that by far the most strides are occurring on the poultry side of things. And so where much more work needs to be done is in the swine and beef industries. If you look pretty closely at those commitments, it's usually only chicken. So we were really eager to see more happen in swine and beef. Another example I'll share, this already came up a bit, but fish, seafood, and oceans. So the reason this gets a score of a 3, so 3 basically means status quo. Right. Not enough is, we didn't take steps backwards. We didn't sort of go, we didn't sit on our heels, but we really didn't, as an industry, act appropriately enough. So the reason it gets some credit, essentially, is that when Americans do consume fish and seafood, for the most part, it's when they eat away from home. This has to do with, people not liking the smell of fish if they cook at home, it being maybe perceived as more of a special occasion thing. There are all kinds of reasons maybe why that happens. And what's great to see is that most, again, I think it's fair to say now it's more of the rule rather than the exception to have a very public commitment to sustainable sourcing of seafood. And I think the question really remains how, there's a note here about beware of self-referential sustainable seafood programs, because sometimes it's not that they may say we source sustainably when possible or something very euphemistic like that, but they really might not have that high of a percentage that are, say, the highest tier of the Monterey Bay Aquarium Seafood Watch program. So that's where we need to get a little bit more rigorous, or see more rigor on the part of many companies. And there's a huge range, of course. Some are committed to only the highest standard. But the other really big issue facing fish, seafood, and oceans that we did explore is the amount of fraud that occurs. So there's a report that came out that about a third of all fish in the U.S. is mislabeled. That's just shocking, right? And there's such a lack of traceability. To my earlier point about transparency, there's a huge amount of illegal fishing. There's forced labor. The question of just which species we're really putting on the menu is really up in the air. So we need a lot more to happen there, and the question from the audience is certainly warranted. So I think there's little snippets of hope and things that are occurring, but not in proportion to the severity of the issue. So the last one very much so. The last one that I'll mention is water sustainability. So I encourage you in the Menus of Change annual report to check out this infographic, which basically summarizes the different water footprints that different ingredients have. And essentially the headline is that animal-based foods, by and large, tend to have the highest water footprints. That was why I said earlier that by far, if I had to only pick one thing, red meat reduction is the biggest impact on the environment. Also happens to just coincidentally have the biggest impact on chronic disease risk, but it's usually what has the highest, greenhouse gas emission impact, also has the highest water impact. Has to do with just efficiency, essentially. You have to grow all the food to feed the cows instead of just eating the food. But the point really with water sustainability and why this issue got our lowest score this year, which was a 2, is that there is not nearly enough awareness, or if there is awareness, there's not nearly enough response occurring, given how much drought and groundwater depletion are affecting um, crops, just the amount of food, food security you look at, the overall issues that will occur from this depletion in agriculture, which of course the food service industry cannot exist without. Agriculture is responsible for over 70% of global water demand. And so this is a serious issue that we're really not seeing any major companies come forward with long-term, robust water sustainability programs. We've scanned all over, and many have energy programs or climate, sustainability programs, but you'll see that water, by and large, is sort of not part of the conversation. So we really are looking for greater attention to the not only the water footprints of ingredients, which is really important in sourcing, the methods that are used, so having conversations with your suppliers and your growers. Are you using flood irrigation? Are you using more efficient, more precise methods of irrigation? What about where you are in the country? Are you even menuing things that are suitable for that region? Are you growing things as a producer that are suitable in that region? So, we refer to this as kind of a place-based issue. So I live in California, right? This is incredibly important. We've been in a very long multi-year drought. So just far more attention is needed. Plant Forward gets you there in many ways because of what I said, that plant-based foods just happen to require less water to produce. But we're really eager for more food service companies to take leadership on this important issue. So the last one that I'll just mention very briefly, so the last one that I'll mention just very briefly is diet and health. And this essentially just captures,
Thank you, Sophie. And
there was a interest in sharing kind of what we talked about at the summit this year that was related to this. And a lot of what we talked about was actually applauding efforts in improving overall diet quality and health. And what I mean by that is that although we still have a long, long way to go, we are seeing that beef consumption in the US has gone down slightly. We are seeing, at least in terms of what's available, a lot more vegetables and fruits. Not yet quite seeing it in the consumption data, but in terms of what the restaurant and food service industry are doing, you definitely see more options, more at least sort of trends around vegetable-centric. The stigma, I think, against it is certainly shifted. And the other thing that's really key in why diet quality has improved is that actually sugar-sweetened beverage consumption, soda consumption, has gone down a lot in the U.S. And this is huge. Of course, it's not only in the context of restaurants and food service, eating away from home, but that is a big place. And so we're seeing, more compelling options like agua frescas or spa waters, or all kinds of healthier beverages that are really making it less appealing to choose that as your go-to when eating away from home. So just wanted to end there on a rosier note than the water crisis. But there's mostly a lot of good news in this 2018 to 2017, but much work ahead.
Yep. And beverages also including all the
Mm-hmm.
fermented beverages that we're seeing now too, right? The shrubs and the kombuchas and things like that, which will make it really flavorful and interesting and very health focused. Um, so everyone, as Sophie mentioned, the Menus of Change website is menusofchange.org, and you can see all of this information and download it for yourself. It's pretty interesting to look at the dashboard and look at the different categories and how the scores have evolved over the last several years since we started the program. And that's not directly related to Menus of Change always, but a good portion of some of the improvements are significantly relatable to this particular initiative and the widespread information that is disseminated through this initiative. Maybe, Sophie, you can briefly touch on the the Research Council, the University Research Council that is an
Yeah,
outgrowth of Menus
definitely.
of Change,
So
which
I'll
actually
end on
helps
this
us
because it's
to
really
directly impact
essentially
menus
it's a network
related
that
to
shows
these
that
principles.
implementing the principles is possible, and not only possible but popular. That it is, financially can lower food costs. That it is the way of the future. So the Menus of Change University Research Collaborative is an initiative that we lead in partnership with Stanford University. And it's about 55 colleges and universities, mostly in the United States, but several outside of the US as well, who have all committed to Menus of Change principles in their dining operations. These include not only, a wide number of really prestigious universities like Stanford. So, we have Ivy Leagues, Princeton and Harvard and Columbia and so on, but a surprising, or what might be surprising, number of large state schools in the middle of the country. So Ohio State University, University of North Texas, Kansas State University, and they all learn from each other the most effective strategies for implementing Menus of Change principles. And so this happens through different working groups and peer learning communities virtually, as well as in person at the Menus of Change conference and in an annual meeting. But it also occurs through a really groundbreaking new research paradigm where we use campus dining halls as living laboratories for behavior change. So this allows us to really evaluate in real world settings as opposed to laboratory settings, what actually works. What types of language around leading with menu messaging around flavor actually get someone to choose a vegetable or a meat-based dish, or if you want people to waste less food, what kinds of ways can you design the kitchen, or the dining hall setting? What kinds of posters? All sorts of nudging and language and the social and environmental context that shapes eating behavior, which, as I mentioned at the very beginning of this talk, is really the stuff that I just can't get enough of. So this is a really fun initiative, but as I said, it really just demonstrates that students are demanding this, that the colleges and universities of the United States are saying, in order to be competitive, because food now has become actually a recruiting tool in getting students to accept your school versus another, offering the most healthful and sustainability promoting food options to our future generations is going to be the way forward. So that really is telling in terms of the industry. The other thing I'll just mention in terms of that this can be done is it's certainly not limited to those contexts. Yes, we have other non-commercial leaders like Compass Group North America, a very large contract food service provider, Google Food in a corporate setting, which you might imagine is sort of similar to a campus dining setting. But actually just last month I was talking with the director of food and beverage for Sweetgreen, and a very large fast casual chain growing rapidly. And they actually use the Menus of Change annual report and the dashboard, much of the language from Menus of Change, as the founding framework for their own food philosophy. So it's really fascinating if you start to look at a lot of Sweetgreen's menu, the way they market things, their website. You see the transparency in terms of their sourcing and their relationships. They have their own farm. They're a version of vertically integrated. You see absolutely an inherently plant-forward concept, no question, but really just even the degree of seasonality that they use. They occasionally will use meat as a garnish. So it's just really exciting to see. By no means is this limited to the non-commercial space. Sweetgreen, of course, being a salad chain is a little bit unique, but it's again an example of a place where it's the business of healthy, sustainable food choices. Sweetgreen, I think, is by every stretch a successful business, and we are seeing countless others. So those are some exciting examples that show us the way forward. And the great news is that the annual report is a place where we're always learning case studies and lessons from these different organizations who have the hard work of actually implementing these principles day in, day out. So I encourage you to check that out. It's a great way to learn from others who've made it work.
Excellent. Thank you so much for joining us today, Sophie. You've definitely demonstrated how important these principles are for us and for our future,
Thanks for having
for
me.
everything related to our food industry, and also how it can contribute to successful business opportunities. So really appreciate it. Please stay on, everyone, for a minute while I will tell you a little bit about what's going on in Food Business School. And also remember to check out menusofchange.org website, because not only is all this information there, but if you are interested in attending the conference next year as a food service professional, the information about that conference will be on that website. It takes place in June. Next one will be June 2019 at the CIA's Hyde Park, New York campus. So just briefly, I'd like to tell you a little bit about our most exciting news from Food Business School and the CIA, which is that we have just launched our very first ever master's degree program, the Master of Professional Studies in Food Business. It's a 2-year, primarily online master's degree specifically focused on food business. So we are so excited to launch this. We've been working on it for several years now, and we've launched it with our first initial cohort of 22 students, which are just in their first online courses as of last week. Our next start date is September of 2019, so please feel free to check out the website to learn more about that program, and you can also call me directly to ask any further questions, but you can get to the website from foodbusinessschool.org. There's a direct link to the Master of Professional Studies website. In addition, we have a version of our 2-day From Concept to Shelf course coming up at the end of November, November 30th and December 1st at our CIA at Copia campus in Napa Valley. And that's for anyone who is interested in launching a food product to market, taught by Chris Cornyn, who is a food expert in launching products. So please check that out on our foodbusinessschool.org website as well. Finally, our next FoodBiz Plus will be FoodBiz Plus Social Enterprise, taking place on October 17th, 11:30 Pacific and 2:30 Eastern, talking with the founder of Kuli Kuli. And we are really excited to speak with her about social enterprise food businesses. So thank